The signal arrived at 03:17 Greenwich Mean Time on a Tuesday, which struck many people later as an oddly mundane hour for the world to change forever. It came on every frequency simultaneously: radio, microwave, tight beam laser, and two additional spectra that human instruments had never bothered to monitor because no known natural phenomenon produced them. Every television on Earth interrupted its broadcast. Every smartphone buzzed. The emergency alert systems in 47 countries fired at once, producing a sound that people in coastal Japan would later describe as the sky clearing its throat. The message was in perfect English, Mandarin, Arabic, Spanish, Russian, and Hindi. It had clearly been compiled from intercepted transmissions, assembled with the cold efficiency of a civilization that did not need to guess what humanity valued. It had simply listened for long enough to know. The voice was smooth, almost pleasant, the kind of voice a luxury car manufacturer might use for a television advertisement. People of Earth, you are addressed by the Vethkai Dominion, 8th Expansion Fleet, operating under the full authority of Supreme Commander Varathas Zol. Your system has been assessed in designated Resource Zone 41. You have 72 hours to transmit formal acknowledgement of vassalage status, open your orbital infrastructure for Dominion integration, and cease all military production. Compliance guarantees preservation of your population centers and cultural archives. Non-compliance will be addressed with proportional force. This message will repeat. And it did, every 11 minutes without variation for the next 6 hours. In the Galactic Conclave's observation post, a sleek station parked at Earth's L4 Lagrange point, staffed by a rotating crew of diplomatic observers from 11 species. The atmosphere was one of practiced, almost bored familiarity. Senior Archivist Thessaly Vorn of the Galactic Archives sipped something warm from a sealed container and watched the feeds from Earth's surface with the mild interest of someone watching weather develop. 17 minutes faster than their approach on Karath IV, she noted to no one in particular. Her junior colleague, a young Marin named Pivas who had only been stationed here 8 months, looked up from his console with wide secondary eyes. "Do you think they'll negotiate or just surrender outright?" he asked. Vorn considered this. "Negotiate first. They always do. It's a pride thing. They'll make noise for about 30 hours, then someone with authority will open a channel and begin asking about terms. The Vethkai will offer slightly better conditions than their initial statement implied. They always do. It keeps the process moving, and by hour 60 you'll have a signed vassalage agreement. It's really quite efficient." She set down her container. "Varathas Zol has done this 12 times personally. He's very good at it." Pivas nodded, logging the timestamp of the initial broadcast. "Have you ever seen a species refuse entirely?" Vorn was quiet for a moment. The Dravathi tried on their second moon colony. They had a small defense fleet. The Vethkai destroyed it in 4 hours and they surrendered by the end of the day. She paused. "The humans don't have a meaningful defense fleet. A few orbital platforms, some missile systems, nothing the Dominion couldn't sweep aside in an afternoon." Below them, on the blue-green world that hung in the black, the lights of cities burned steadily. There were no visible signs of panic, no mass evacuations visible from orbit. The arterial glow of highway networks pulsed with ordinary traffic. Vorn found that slightly odd but attributed it to the hour. In Geneva, the UN Emergency Security Council had been in session for 40 minutes. The Secretary General, a sharp-faced Finnish woman named Elina Mekkonen, had said very little since the meeting opened. She sat at the head of the table with her hands folded and her expression unreadable, listening to her advisors speak in urgent, overlapping voices about response options, diplomatic channels, potential terms of negotiation. When the room finally went quiet, she spoke. "Pull up Pale Verdict," she said. "Current status, readiness assessment, and projected timeline to full activation." The room went very still. Several people exchanged glances. One man, the defense liaison from the European bloc, leaned forward as if he hadn't heard correctly. Mekinen looked at him with calm, flat eyes. "You heard me." Outside, the Vethkai signal played again. The sky, in its way, cleared its throat once more. Nobody in the room was listening to it anymore. Archivist Thessaly Vorn had spent 41 years working for the Galactic Archives, and she considered herself a thorough woman. She had filed pre-contact assessments on 19 species. She had observed 7 first-contact events. She had written the definitive academic paper on the psychological patterns of civilizations facing their first Dominion ultimatum, which had been cited 260 times in the scholarly literature, and had earned her a modest commendation from the Archives Council. She had never actually read a complete history of humanity. She started reading one at hour 14, when the silence from Earth's governments was beginning to feel slightly unusual. Not alarming, just unusual. She pulled the most comprehensive document the archives had on human civilization, a 7,000-page synthetic history compiled from intercepted broadcasts, archaeological data triangulated from surface scans, and the few direct cultural exchanges that had occurred in the 18 months since first contact was officially acknowledged. She started at the beginning. She was a thorough woman. By page 40, she had encountered her first siege, a city called Carthage. The humans who had besieged it had been so thorough in their destruction that archaeologists, centuries later, found the very salt they had allegedly sown into the ground. She noted this with mild interest and continued reading. By page 200, she had read about a tactic called scorched earth, the deliberate destruction of one's own infrastructure, crops, supply lines, and cities specifically to deny them to an advancing enemy. She found 17 distinct historical examples. The Russians had done it to Napoleon. They had done it again to a man named Hitler. The second time, they had burned the entire agricultural output of a territory the size of a small planet rather than let it feed an enemy army. She set down her warm drink. By page 400, she had encountered the concept of mutually assured destruction, a strategic doctrine in which a civilization deliberately maintains the capacity to annihilate its enemy even after absorbing a lethal first strike, for no purpose other than to ensure that attacking them is never worth it. They had lived under this doctrine for decades, not for weeks, decades. 2 of their largest nations had pointed enough explosive yield at each other to sterilize their planet's surface, and had done so calmly, for generations, as a matter of national policy, and somehow this had kept the peace. She sent a brief message to the archive's main office on Conclave Station 7. Recommend pulling full military history cross-reference for Earth. I may have missed something in the pre-contact assessment. She kept reading. At page 600, she found the human's own writing on the subject, military philosophy, strategy, doctrine. There was a man named Sun Tzu who had understood war as a fundamentally psychological contest, won before the first blow was struck. There was a man named Clausewitz who had written that war was politics continued by other means, which implied that for humans, violence was not a breakdown of negotiation but simply another instrument of it. There were dozens of others. They had an entire academic discipline, multiple disciplines, dedicated to the theory and practice of organized killing. They taught it in universities. They gave advanced degrees in it. Pivas found her staring at her screen at hour 18, her warm drink long cold beside her. "You've gone very quiet," he said. "Do you know," she said slowly, "what a dead-hand system is?" "No. It is a system designed to launch nuclear weapons automatically if the government that controls them is destroyed, so that even if you kill everyone in charge, the weapons still fire. They built one. They actually built one." She turned to look at him. "And then they argued about whether it was ethical for 30 years, which is the part I find most remarkable." Pivas was quiet for a moment. "Should we be more worried than we are?" Vorn looked back at her screen, down at the planet. The lights of the cities were still burning. No panic, no visible evacuations, No emergency broadcasts that her instruments could detect. Everything calm, everything quiet. "I have sent a recommendation to the archives," she said. "I do not think anyone will act on it in time." She picked up her cold drink and stared at it. "Do you know what the humans call a strategy of deliberately allowing an enemy to believe they are winning, right up until the moment they are not?" "No." She looked at the blue-green world below them, turning slowly in the dark. "They call it a trap," she said quietly, "and they have a great many words for it." Operation Pale Verdict had been written in 2031, during the second year of what the public knew as the Extended Fermi Initiative, a government program ostensibly dedicated to preparing Earth's infrastructure for long-range space colonization. The program had indeed produced infrastructure, just not the kind most people imagined. The full document was classified at a level that did not officially exist. It had been revised 11 times in 14 years. Its authors included military strategists, astrophysicists, psychologists specializing in threat response, game theorists from 4 different nations, and one elderly woman from New Zealand who had spent her career studying how island civilizations responded to existential naval threats. The woman had been 91 when she contributed her final notes. She had died 2 years later, and her family had been told she spent her last years consulting on climate preparedness. The document's central premise was simple. If a technologically superior force arrives and issues an ultimatum, negotiation is a trap. Every historical case study the document cited, and it cited 47, showed the same pattern. The species that negotiated from a position of weakness did not get better terms. They got the same terms, slightly reworded, after the enemy had used the negotiation window to reinforce their position. The document called this the velvet cage. You walked in thinking you were talking your way to freedom. The door closed behind you. Pale Verdict's answer was not to walk through the door at all. By hour 4 of the Vethkai ultimatum, the activation codes had been transmitted to 7 orbital platforms, 3 deep space relay networks, and a system of mass driver installations on the lunar surface that had been officially listed as mineral extraction infrastructure since 2034. The crews operating those installations had been told, when they were hired, that they might one day receive a code word that would change their job description entirely. They had all signed documents. They had all understood. Most of them had hoped, quietly and privately, that the day would never come. The code word was Meridian. It came through at hour 4.7. At the same time, every major city on Earth began its evacuation. Not the frantic, chaotic kind that plays out in disaster films, with clogged highways and panicking crowds. This was the other kind, the kind that had been rehearsed. 47 cities worldwide had run climate emergency drills in the past 3 years. Populations had been walked through the procedures. Transit systems had been stress-tested. Underground shelters built, officially for seismic events, had been stocked for something else entirely. The Vethkai, watching from their fleet, saw the traffic patterns change slightly. Their analysts noted increased movement in urban centers. Their report to Supreme Commander Varathas Zol assessed this as civilian panic response, consistent with low-technology population stress behavior. Zol read the report and filed it without concern. Panicking populations surrendered faster. This was well established. In Geneva, Secretary General Mekinen was on her 4th hour of continuous briefings. She had not slept. She did not appear to need to. The people in the room with her had learned over the past 4 hours that she was exactly the kind of person you wanted making decisions at the end of the world, not because she was warm or reassuring, but because she appeared to experience fear as information rather than as feeling. She processed it, filed it, and kept moving. "Timeline on the lunar installations," she said. "Full charge at hour 68, said the defense liaison. "We have a 4-hour window before the Vethkai ultimatum expires." "And the deep space relay buoys?" "Broadcasting on schedule. The payload left at hour 2. It is currently," he checked his screen, 8.4 million kilometers downrange and accelerating. Mekinen nodded once, then we are on track. Secretary General. It was one of her advisors, a man who had been opposed to Pale verdict from the beginning. He spoke carefully. If we actually do this, there is no coming back from it. The Galactic Conclave will. The Galactic Conclave, Mekinen said, watched 17 civilizations get swallowed by this empire. They wrote reports about it. She looked at him steadily. We are not writing a report. She stood and walked to the window. Outside, Geneva was quiet. The evacuation was proceeding 3 levels below the street. Trains were moving underground, smooth and silent, carrying people toward the mountain shelters with the calm efficiency of a civilization that had spent a decade preparing for exactly this moment. Send the diplomat, she said. I want her on that flagship by hour 24. Tell her to take her time. Ambassador Dr. Sira Akafer was 44 years old, had a doctorate in behavioral economics from Cambridge and a second one in xenolinguistics from a joint program that had only existed for 3 years, and had spent most of her career in rooms where powerful people were trying to get things from each other. She was not tall. She was not physically imposing. She had the kind of face that people tended to underestimate, which she had spent her entire adult life cultivating deliberately. She arrived at the Vethkai flagship in a small shuttle at hour 26, 2 hours after the agreed time, because she had spent an extra 2 hours eating a full breakfast, reviewing her notes unhurriedly, and selecting, with apparent care, which pen to bring. Her aide had watched this and said nothing, because the aide had worked with her for 6 years, and understood that everything Akafer did was intentional, including the things that looked like nothing. The Vethkai flagship was enormous. Docking bay alone glowed and most support, and it smelled of recycled atmosphere and something faintly metallic Akafer suspected was a deliberate choice. An environmental cue meant signal power and technological sophistication. She noted this back of her mind, filed it under to think about these things, which means they can be read. The Supreme Commander Varathis Zol received her in a chamber that was clearly designed for exactly this purpose. High ceilings, asymmetric lighting that kept the Vethkai side of the table brighter. A single chair on Akafer's side positioned 2 centimeters lower than the Vethkai delegation seats. She knew all of it. She sat down, set her single folder on the table, folded it on top, and looked at Zol with an expression of polite, unhurried attention. Zol was longer than the brief had suggested, nearly 2.5 meters, with the layered structure that characterized his species' dominant cast, pale gold-gray in the ship's interior lighting. His secondary eyes, the smaller pair set above the primary, were already fixed on her with the kind of focused intensity that the briefings had described as a Vethkai dominance display. Akafer looked back at him with the same expression she used for difficult university administrators. Ambassador Akafer, Zol began, in accented but precise English. I am gratified your government has chosen to engage. It demonstrates wisdom. Thank you for having me, Akafer said pleasantly. I have some questions, if you don't mind, purely for clarification. I want to make sure I understand the full scope of what's being proposed. Zol's secondary eyes flickered. He had expected opening statements, counter-proposals, perhaps some performative outrage. Questions were unusual. Of course, he said after a brief pause. Akafer opened her folder. She had questions. She had 41 of them, organized by category, and she asked every single one with the patient thoroughness of a woman who genuinely needed to understand. She asked about the specific legal framework of vassalage status under Dominion law. She asked about the historical precedent for resource extraction agreements. She asked about the rights of vassal populations under the 8th Expansion Fleet's previous acquisitions. She asked follow-up questions. She asked clarifying questions about the clarifying questions. 3 hours into the session, Zol's senior diplomatic aide passed him a note that read, "This is a delay tactic." Zol wrote back, "Obviously, let her talk. The clock is ours. He was not wrong about that, he believed. He was simply wrong about whose clock was running. While HFY talked, the deep space relay buoys continued their tight beam broadcasts toward a set of coordinates that the Vethkai fleet's navigation charts showed as empty space. Zoll's intelligence division had noted the broadcasts in their hourly summary and flagged them as unknown purpose, possibly civilian communication infrastructure. They had not been able to crack the encoding. They had noted this with mild professional embarrassment and moved on. At hour 40, HFY asked for a recess for personal biological needs, which took her 40 minutes. While she was gone, Zoll ate a small meal and reviewed the surface readings from Earth. The unusual traffic patterns had stabilized. Several large urban areas showed significantly reduced heat signatures, which his analysts interpreted as energy conservation measures taken by a frightened population. HFY returned with a fresh cup of tea and 30 more questions. Zoll, for the first time in his 12 campaigns, found himself hoping a negotiation would end soon. Not because it was going badly, because there was something about this woman's absolute, unshakable calm that he could not locate within his existing framework for understanding conquered peoples. Something about it that sat at the back of his primary brain like a splinter too small to find but impossible to ignore. He told himself it was nothing. He had felt discomfort before. It always passed. At hour 68, Supreme Commander Varathas Zoll made his first mistake. He had grown impatient. It was not a trait he typically permitted himself. Impatience was a weakness, and Zoll was not a weak commander, but something about this campaign had gotten under his carapace in a way he could not precisely identify. The humans had said very little of substance in 44 hours of active negotiation. Their ambassador had asked questions, taken notes, requested clarifications, consumed an implausible amount of tea, and committed to absolutely nothing. The Dominion's psychological profilers had assessed this as a classic stall from a civilization too proud to formally surrender but too frightened to refuse. Standard, textbook, dull. And yet, the heat signatures from Earth cities continued to drop, not from energy conservation. Zoll's senior sensor analyst had re-examined the data at hour 65 and brought him a revised assessment. The signatures were dropping because the populations were leaving. Mass movement, systematic, covering multiple urban centers simultaneously, all moving inward and downward, toward the planet's interior, toward mountain ranges, toward infrastructure that scans suggested was far more extensive underground than any of their pre-contact surveys had indicated. Zoll had read that report and felt something cold move through him, not fear. He refused to name it fear, but something adjacent. He decided a demonstration was necessary. Not to destroying a city before the deadline was poor form, and the conclave observers would file protests that would take months to clear, but to demonstrate. To remind the humans of the basic physical reality of their situation. A targeted strike on a coastal city. Precise. Surgical. Enough to produce a crater where there had been buildings and let the image speak for itself. He selected Porto, Portugal from his target catalog. Population, approximately 300,000. Coastal, photogenic coastline. The crater would be visible from space and would read well on whatever surveillance systems the galactic observers were running. The strike fired at hour 68.3. The energy beam crossed the distance to Earth's surface in 1.4 seconds. It struck the designated coordinates with the precision that 12 campaigns had refined to an art form. The yield was calibrated for maximum structural destruction and minimum thermal spread. A clean hit, professional, the kind of work Zoll took quiet pride in. The crater was exactly the right size. It was also completely, perfectly, absolutely empty. Not damaged, not burning, empty. No rubble that suggested prior structures, no organic material, no residual heat signatures from bodies or infrastructure. The targeting data confirmed a direct hit on what should have been the city's central district, and what they had instead hit was a clean scar in bedrock, as if the city had been lifted away and the ground beneath it polished. Zoll stared at the sensor readout for a long time. "Run the targeting diagnostic again," he said. "Diagnostic complete," his weapons officer said. "Strike was accurate to within 0.03% of target coordinates." "Then where," Zoll said very quietly, "is the city?" Nobody answered him, because nobody knew. Ambassador Akaffer, who had been sitting in the recess chamber with her folder and her tea when the strike fired, was brought back into the negotiation room by a junior Vethkai aide who looked, for the first time since she had arrived, genuinely unsettled. She sat down. She folded her hands. She looked at Zoll, who was still staring at the sensor display, and waited. A signal arrived from Earth 17 seconds after the strike. It played on the room's speakers without warning, on the same frequency the Vethkai used for fleet-to-fleet communication, which meant someone on Earth had been listening to their internal channels and had figured out the encryption. The voice was a flat, recorded synthesis. No emotion, no drama, just words. "We have been ready, have you?" The room was very quiet. Akaffer took a slow sip of her tea. She did not look at Zoll. She looked at her folder, as if reviewing her notes for the next question. The pen she had brought, the one she had spent 2 hours selecting, once softly in her hand. Outside the flagship's hull, the black and silent space between the world, the clock ticked over hour 69. Hour 72 arrived the way deadlines do. They have always been a formality, not with drama, but with the soft, inevitable click of a mechanism that was built correctly, has been running since the moment it was moved. Ambassador Akaffer stood up. The movement was unhurried. She capped her pen. She straightened the pages and folded with a single light tap against the table. She picked up her tea, still warm. She had timed well and took a final sip. Then she set the cup down and looked at the screen of Rath's soul, the expression of a woman completing a routine professional obligation. "Thank you for your time," she said. "It's been very informative." She walked to the door. "Ambassador," Zoll's voice was tight, controlled but tight. "We have not reached an agreement." "No," Akaffer agreed, pausing at the doorway without turning around. "We haven't." She considered for a moment. "I recommend you check your communications from home." She walked out. The Vethkai aide scrambled to follow her, uncertain whether to detain her or escort her, and ultimately did what junior aides do in all species when authority fails to give clear direction: followed at a safe distance and said nothing. 12 seconds later, every mass driver array on Earth's lunar surface fired simultaneously. The physics of a mass driver are straightforward. You take a dense object, in this case, tungsten alley rods, each approximately the size of a telephone pole, each weighing close to 9,000 kilograms, and you accelerate it to a significant fraction of the speed of light using electromagnetic rails. No explosive payload, no warhead, just metal and velocity and the simple, inarguable mathematics of kinetic energy, 1/2 times mass times velocity squared. At the velocities the human installations achieved, 9,000 kilograms of tungsten became approximately equivalent to a small nuclear device. Without the radiation, without the fallout, without the political complications that tended to follow nuclear strikes in galactic diplomatic contexts. The payload had left 71.6 hours ago. The coordinates had been calculated before Akaffer boarded her shuttle. The entire negotiation, 44 hours of tea and questions and clicking pens, had been timed to the minute, because the math of an interstellar kinetic strike does not forgive imprecision. The Vethkai homeworld Vethkara was approximately 26 light-hours from Sol. It was not destroyed. The humans had been careful about that. Careful and deliberate. The mass driver barrage was not designed to shatter the planet. Shattering planets was crude and created debris fields that caused problems for neighboring systems, and the humans had apparently considered this. Instead, the rod struck in a precise global pattern, targeting tectonic stress points identified from 17 months of deep scan analysis, triggering a cascade of geological events that would render the planet's surface uninhabitable within 72 hours and remain so for approximately 800 years. The Vethkai homeworld had a population of 11 billion. The evacuation signal had been broadcast to Vethkara 36 hours earlier, on a frequency the Vethkai used for planetary emergency alerts, in the Vethkai language, by the same deep space relay buoys that Zol's intelligence division had flagged as civilian communication infrastructure. The humans had given them 36 hours to get their people underground, into orbital stations, onto any transport available. The message had included coordinates of the incoming strike vectors, a timeline of the geological cascade, and a survival briefing that one Vethkai engineer, watching the evacuation from an orbital station, would later describe as disturbingly thorough. It was not a weapon of genocide. It was a message. The message was, "We did not come to your fleet, we came to your home. We could have done this in silence without warning and you would have had nothing. We gave you time because we are not what you think we are. But understand clearly we can do this and we chose to." On the Vethkai flagship, the first reports from Vethkara began arriving in fragments, each one worse than the last. Zol sat in his command chair and read them with the stillness of a being whose entire framework for understanding the universe was being disassembled and replaced with something he did not yet have words for. HFY's shuttle was already 20 kilometers away when the alarm started. She did not look back. Archivist Thessaly Vorn did not sleep for 31 hours after the strike. She sat at her console on the observation post at Earth's L4 point and read every incoming communication, every conclave dispatch, every fragment of signal traffic that her instruments could pull from the suddenly, extraordinarily busy galactic communication network. And she felt, for the first time in 41 years of professional service, that she had fundamentally misunderstood her job. Her job, she had always believed, was to observe and record, to be present at significant events and produce accurate documentation. She had been very good at this. She had been present at 7 first contact events, 3 species integration ceremonies, and 1 minor border conflict that had been resolved without significant casualties. She had produced clear, accurate, dispassionate records of all of them. The archives had commended her work repeatedly. She had been present at the first planetary-scale kinetic strike in recorded galactic history, and she had missed it because she had not believed it was possible. The Galactic Conclave's response was immediate and enormous. 47 member species transmitted formal protests to Earth within 6 hours of the strike confirmation. The language ranged from stern diplomatic rebuke to something that Vorn's translation matrix could only render as appalled cosmic horror. The Conclave's Enforcement Council convened an emergency session. 3 separate resolutions were drafted in the first 12 hours, each condemning the strike in progressively stronger terms. None of them were transmitted to Earth, because 3 of the Conclave's oldest members quietly declined to co-sponsor any resolution until the legal question of whether the Vethkai ultimatum constituted a prima facie act of war under Interstellar Compact Article 7 had been resolved. The legal question was not simple. It was, in fact, extraordinarily complicated. The lawyers on Conclave Station 7 were going to be busy for years. The Vethkai 8th Expansion Fleet remained in Sol system for 11 hours after the strike. They did not attack. They did not advance. They held position in a tight formation that Vorn recognized from her reading as a posture that had no tactical name in the human military literature, because humans had never needed one. It was the posture of a force that was present in body, but had ceased to be present in any meaningful strategic sense. The fleet's communication traffic indicated that Supreme Commander Zol had locked himself in his personal command suite and was not responding to requests for orders. The fleet's second-in-command, a being named Kethvara, transmitted a single message to Earth at hour 11 post-strike. It said, "We are withdrawing. We request safe passage." Earth's response came back in 40 seconds. "Safe passage granted. You are not our enemy. You are welcome to leave." Of the 17 worlds the Vethkai Dominion had absorbed as vassals over the past century, 14 went silent on Dominion communication channels within 24 hours of the strike. The silence was not hostile. It was the particular quality of silence that belongs to people who are sitting very still, listening to something change, trying to understand what comes next. 3 of them transmitted directly to Earth, not to the Conclave, not to any neutral party, to Earth. The Kareth, whose planet had been vassalized 22 years earlier, and who had lost approximately 30% of their industrial output to Dominion extraction since, sent a message that Vorn's translation matrix rendered with the note, "Untranslatable emotional register, closest approximation." We did not know this was possible, and now that we know, we cannot unknow it. Vorn filed her report to the archives at hour 28. It was the longest document she had produced in her career. The final paragraph read, "It is this archivist's assessment that the pre-contact evaluation of Earth was fundamentally incomplete. The review process should have begun with the military history archive rather than the cultural and scientific indices. This is not a species that failed to develop sophisticated weapons. It is a species that developed sophisticated weapons early, lived with them intimately, thought about them deeply, argued about them ethically, and arrived at the moment of first contact not naive about force but more comprehensively educated in its application and its consequences than any species this archivist has previously assessed. The error was ours. The record reflects this." She submitted the report. Then she sat in the quiet of the observation post, looked at the blue-green world below her, and thought about a people who had spent 100,000 years making war on each other, and had emerged from it not broken but, somehow, wise. Strange, she thought, remarkable and strange. Pivas brought her something warm to drink without being asked. She accepted it without looking up. The transmission went out at hour 48 post-strike, on every galactic conclave frequency, in every language that Earth's linguists had managed to construct reliable translation matrices for. It was not long. It ran to 4 minutes and 19 seconds. Secretary General Mekinen had written the first draft herself, in longhand, on a piece of paper, at a desk in a mountain shelter outside Geneva, while the last of the city's evacuation trains rolled back above her. It did not open with triumph. It did not use the word victory. It began like this: "To the peoples of the Galactic Conclave, to the Vethkai Dominion, and to the 14 vassal worlds that have not yet had the chance to speak for themselves, we are humanity. We are one species from one planet, and until 18 months ago, we did not know with certainty that anyone else existed. We have now had some time to observe how the galaxy works, and we have a few things to say." It went on to offer the Vethkai fleet food stores, medical assistance, and safe passage to whatever staging point they needed to begin the recovery of their homeworld. It specified the quantities available and the coordinates where the transfers could take place. It offered the same to any Vethkai civilian population that required assistance. It did not attach conditions to the aid. It simply offered it plainly, the way a person offers a hand to someone who has just fallen, regardless of why they fell. The Conclave's communications infrastructure registered a brief anomaly at this point in the broadcast. A statistical spike in simultaneous incoming message traffic from multiple relay points, which the communications engineers would later identify as the sound of 11 species trying to react to the same unexpected thing at the same moment. The transmission continued. It offered full integration support to the 14 vassal worlds, technical assistance, resource development partnerships, contact with Earth's own network of institutions. No strings, no extraction agreements, No terms of trade that required legal review by a Dominion-adjacent authority. The language was specific enough that it was clearly not improvised. This had been drafted before the strike. The offer was part of the plan. Then came the part that would be quoted, in varying translations, for the next several hundred years. We have one condition for peace. Not for aid, aid comes without condition, but for peace, which is a different thing and requires an agreement. The condition is this: no government, fleet, or authority shall issue an ultimatum to another civilization and call it diplomacy. An ultimatum is not a negotiation. It is a door with only one side. We have looked at the history of this galaxy, and we have seen what doors with only one side produce. We have some experience with this kind of door. We know what it feels like from the inside. We will not accept it, and we will not allow others to accept it on our behalf, and we will not watch it happen to anyone else if we can prevent it. This is not a threat. It is an explanation of who we are. The transmission ended there. No signature, no seal, no title, just the message. Ambassador HFY was appointed Earth's first permanent galactic ambassador 3 days later. The appointment was handled with the same lack of ceremony as everything else she did. A brief announcement, a revised identification credential, a new office on the conclave station that she furnished herself with a chair, a desk, and a kettle. When the conclave's secretary-marshal came to congratulate her on the appointment, she thanked him with a handshake and asked if he had time for a few questions. He had heard about the questions. He said yes anyway. The Vethkai homeworld surface remained uninhabitable for the next 812 years, which was 11 years longer than the geophysical models had projected. The 11 billion Vethkai who had evacuated in the 36-hour window were sheltered partly in orbital stations, partly in underground facilities on their 2 surviving colony worlds, and partly, in a development that surprised everyone including the humans, on temporary habitat platforms that Earth's orbital construction teams began deploying at hour 60, before the strike had even landed. On the grounds that it was better to have them, and not need them than to need them, and not have them. The galaxy did not become peaceful. Humanity was not naive enough to believe it would. There were more disputes, more crises, more moments when force moved closer to the table than anyone wanted. But something had shifted. Some fundamental assumption about what the cost of coercion looked like had been revised, permanently, in the strategic calculations of every fleet command and every government and every species that sat in the conclave's chambers and watched the feeds from Earth and asked itself, quietly, whether it truly understood who it was dealing with. HFY sat in her small office on Conclave Station 7, looked at the questions in her folder. There were always more questions, and drank her tea. She still looked bored. She was not bored. She was the most attentive person in the room, and she always had been, and the galaxy was slowly, uncomfortably, beginning to realize it.